Hello, this is Evan Moore, and welcome to part 2 of the K2 Appit for SharePoint demo. In this demo, we're going to run through a quick build session on how to build the workflow and forms and the general idea of building out an application within K2 Appit that you saw back up the runtime experience we saw previously. The first thing you'll notice is that we're on a standard SharePoint site. After we've installed K2 Appit, by using the app library and installing it to each site collection that we want to utilize, we'll go into the service list or the service request list that we're going to use to build our application out in. In this case, you can see that we have two lists, a demo service categories, in which we're going to use as a data source for our form, and the actual demo service request list itself, in which we're going to build the application. You can see here we've already adjusted the proper columns that we'll be using within our item and within our forms. We'll navigate up to the list ribbon, and here we'll find our K2 application and reporting widgets. By launching into the K2 application, we're going to be presented with a first screen asking us what we'd like to do. Those options are going to be create a new application or deploy an existing one. If we already had an application built that we wanted to deploy, an example here might be that we've worked on an application in a development server and wanted to deploy that to a production server, we can simply package that up and deploy it using this action. If we're going to create a new application like we're going to do today, we'd select Create New Application and start generating new assets. You'll also see down below that we have application accelerators. In this particular case, we're in a custom list, so we have one accelerator to use at our disposal for item review. You can click App Details and get a general idea of what this accelerator will build out for you. There's also further accelerators with different types of SharePoint lists and libraries. Depending on the list or library you choose, you'll be presented with the proper accelerators in which to help you build your application out. For example, if you were to choose a task list or a calendar item, you're going to be presented with different accelerators that meet those particular custom SharePoint lists. For this demo purpose, we're going to build out a brand new application from scratch. When I create new application, we're going to be presented with a few options. Of course, it wants to include data, as all of our applications will include data. In this case, we're using our SharePoint list as our main source of data within this application. We're also going to select forms, workflow, and reporting around this application. As we hit OK, Appit is now going to start generating assets behind the scenes. It's going to replace SharePoint's new edit and display forms with K2 SmartForm technology. It's going to create a workflow that'll be kicked off when we submit the form. And it's also going to create reporting that we can utilize to create a dashboard or check bottleneck efficiencies or individual user metric data at the end of an application being run. After K2 Appit has generated the assets, it's going to drop us in to the workflow design tool. You can see here in the workflow design tool that it's a very visual, drag and drop, easy to use system. As we come in, you'll notice at the top that we have some very highly used items available for us in our general folder. We can also navigate over to different categories and look at different actions that we can use within our workflow. See here we have some examples of actions we can use to interact with our Azure Active Directory, a few items to interact with our CRM database, different ways that we can interact with users and even groups, and different ways that we can interact with our list items within our SharePoint list. Again, the main source of data for this particular application. If you recall in our runtime demo, as we finished filling out the form and submitted it, the first thing that happened was an update to that SharePoint list. It updated the status to show submitted, and it gave us a view flow or a link in order to open up our workflow tool and see where that particular form was at. So to do that, we're going to find Update List Item, and we're simply going to drag that to the first step of the workflow. You can see after we've dragged that step down, we're presented with a wizard in order to configure that step. In this particular case, it's going to ask us what list item we want to update. We can drop down and say we want to engage with our demo service request list, and that's what we want to want to update. You can see here that we can also go within our site collection and update an item within the service category if we wanted to, or we could browse outside of our site collection to different site collections across our organization, utilizing them for data to either bring into our form, or in this case, if we wanted to update a list item outside of our site collection. For this demo though, we are going to stick with our SharePoint list in which we're building our application. We'll select Demo Service Request, select Next. Here we're going to be presented with all the metadata fields that have been returned from our SharePoint list. We want to update the status, so we'll select Status and say once that form has been submitted, change that to say Submitted. We also want to have a view flow appear at this point. Instead of just typing in view flow, in which case all we'll see is the words view flow, we want to bring in some contextual information here. So once we submit that form, we'll update our view flow to actually show a link to the view flow. We can move over to our context browser, find our workflow context, what items have to do with our workflow, scroll down to the view flow link, and simply drag and drop it into the necessary field. By doing this, once the form is submitted, we're going to have a live link that opens up our workflow. When this is complete, we can now finish out this step, and our first step is complete. Now we want to move forward onto our next steps. Let's go to our first step and add a new outcome. We can simply name this New Step or Next Step. You may have your own naming conventions as you work through your workflows. Now that we have our next step, we need to assign it an action. In this case, once we've submitted our form, it's routed to a manager in order to schedule it. Let's go back to our general and find a user task, a task that's going to identify someone and assign them a task to do something with. We'll drag this down. We'll name this step. In this case, we'll name it scheduling. We'll move down here and we'll insert some commands. These commands can be whatever you want your outcomes to be. We're not limited to a static list that SharePoint gives us. In this case, we're going to give the options of schedule. Maybe we need to cancel the order. Maybe we want to send this back to be reworked. Again, in this box, we can type whatever commands we want to appear. Maybe you have your own naming conventions for your company or organization that make sense. Let's move forward. It's now going to push forward the editable form. Note here that you don't have to have the editable form. You can change this form to maybe be a display only. Perhaps you want this first level approver not to be able to change anything on the form, but simply view it. You could select the display only version here. In this case, we do want the approver to be able to edit it, so we're going to stick with the editable form. The next step is who to send it to. We have a few options. We could send it back to the originator. In this case, wouldn't make a lot of sense. We could send it to their manager. Maybe that does make sense. We could bring their manager right over here. In this case, we don't want to send it to necessarily the manager of the person submitting the form. We want to send it to the manager of the proper department where that form needs to go. In this particular case, we want to send it to the support manager. So instead of sending it to my manager, let's move over to the context browser. And using that additional SharePoint list that we have, we can drill down, find the manager data within that particular list, and drag that over. Now when we submit that form, instead of going to my manager or the submitter's manager, it's going to go to the manager of the department we selected. Dynamic routing is very important, and this is a very easy way to do that. Once we send it to the manager, we also want to notify that person that they have a new task. We'll select Notify and move forward. By notifying them, we're going to open up our email template. Let's go ahead and customize this email so that we can give them some contextual data to use when they open up their message. The first thing we'll do is put in a subject. This can be whatever you would like it to be. For our demo, we'll just call it, "You have received a service request from," and instead of typing in something static here, we can now go over to our context browser, drill into our SharePoint list where our data lives, and pull a company out. This company name is going to be dynamic depending on what company we returned in that record. This way, when I see my email, I'm going to have a subject line with the company of the actual service request in need. Moving down to the body, dear participant name, you have received a service request Again, we can move over here, select the contact person that we selected, at what company, called, and bring in the title that we put in. Beyond that, we can enter down here and say the issue description. We can now drag that in so that anything we've typed in that issue description will show in the email box. We can now move down here and add any other kind of contextual information that we might want to see. Again, maybe we want to see the view flow. Maybe we want to see a content ID if your organization uses something to identify an order with. Lots of different information here that you can use to populate your email body with so that as the user receives a notification, they have contextual information that will help them make the decision. Now let's move forward. We'll finish out the email and we can go back to our workflow designer and notice that we have 3 different outcomes. And those outcomes are what we labeled them. We have schedule, cancel, or send back to be reworked. Let's work on the send back to be reworked side of our workflow. In order to do this, we need to assign another user task. Again, all we'll do is drag and drop user task down here. Call this a name. We'll call this the rework step. And at this point, we're going to have 2 options. Send back for approval, or maybe we just want to cancel it out. Hit next. Again, we're presented with the form option. We're going to continue using the editable form. We'll move forward. Now this time, we do want to send it back to the originator. In this case, the step is to send it back to the originator. Therefore, we can easily use the originator option and drag that over. At this point, you might also want to send an email to this user, but for the demo purpose, we'll skip that step. We'll finish this out, and again, we've been presented with 2 different options, send back for approval or cancel. What's important to note here is that I don't have to sequentially move forward in my workflow. I can actually loop this step back to the update list item and start the process over again once it's been edited and sent back for approval. I can do that very easily by going back to these rules and using a very visual wizard-based system. Send back for approval step is linked to send back for approval, but instead we want to note that we want to send it back to the update list item. Here's our update list item. Here it is being depicted here in our list with a back arrow showing that it's going to go back in the workflow. Select OK, and here we are. We've now looped this step back to the original point of view where it's going to update the list item. Similarly with cancel, we don't want to build out a whole other leg of the workflow simply to cancel this step when we already have one built out. I can go in here, find my cancel step, move this box out of the way so we can see our workflow and see where we need to send this. Drop this down. I have 2 cancel steps, but I can see because this is an up arrow, I'm going to be moving this up a level to this particular step. Select that, hit OK, and now we've created a sibling step. The further I build out this workflow, anytime there's a cancel step, I can always make this a sibling step and loop it back to this particular cancel. Maybe this step also has an email notification and one further update list item step that I can continually reuse over and over again. At this point, I've built out this particular leg of my workflow. I want to go ahead and test it. So I can use the placeholder item to end these particular ends of the workflow. And at this point, I have a fully functioning workflow that I can now deploy and test. By simply saving this and deploying it, I can submit a form, update the list item, schedule it to be sent back for reworked, have it go back to the originator for edits. They can now either resubmit it for approval or they can cancel it. We'll save. Now instead of deploying, let's exit and go back to our artifacts so that we can take a look at what our forms and views are going to look like. At this point in our build, we have our workflow partially ready to go and saved. And now let's go work on our forms. You'll see here that when we built out all of our assets, we have our smart objects that K2 has automatically built surrounding our SharePoint list. We have multiple views, and we have our replacement forms that were replaced by K2 Smart Forms from SharePoint's original forms. We have our new edit and display form, and we have multiple views. Important to note here that this is a one-to-many relationship. We can have multiple views or multiple sections inside of one form. So to start, instead of opening up our new form, let's take a look at our new view and get this to the point of where it needs to be for our user to use. So we'll check this out. and we'll edit this. And what this does is going to drop us into our view designer. As this opens up, you'll notice on the left we have a pretty structured standard menu item over here that we can use to organize our assets with and our objects. For now, we'll hide this. We have some more real estate. You'll see that we have our SharePoint metadata labels here on the left automatically populated with each field to the right. We have our fields, methods, and controls. Again, this is K2 Appit reaching out to our data source, in this case SharePoint, and returning back fields and methods. An easier way to look at this might be data and actions. K2 has reached out to our SharePoint list and found that each type of data that our SharePoint list is capable of using. It's returned those as fields. It's also returned methods or actions, ways that we can manipulate that data that we can choose from here in a list. Lastly, we have controls. Calendars, checkbox, radio buttons, additional pictures and labels, etc. Ways that we can modify and further customize our form. So starting with our form, let's clean this up a little bit. We have some extra columns here that we want to delete out, extra rows I should say. We'll delete out a few of these extra rows. On our new form, when we're filling this out, we don't need a start date yet. The manager will be selecting this. So for the first time user, we don't need this particular row. We'll delete that out. Our particular process doesn't employ a process ID, although we may want to use that later on down the road. But for a new form being submitted, we don't need to see that. So we'll delete that out. And our new form doesn't yet have a view flow. The view flow is shown after the form is submitted. So for our new form, we'll delete that out as well. Now we have a nice cleaned up view here with only the fields that we're going to want to see when a new user fills out this form. The first field is very easy. We can leave this the same. This is just a title field with a standard text box that we can enter in whatever we'd like. The company field is the first one that we're going to want to change. Remember, this was a picker field that allowed us to query out to our CRM database and return a record. As it stands now, it's simply a text field. Let's highlight this and change it. We'll go up here to our picker control and change this from a standard text box to a picker box. Using our list here, we can find where the picker is, select that, and this field is now a picker field. The next step is pointing this picker field to a database or a line of business application so that it knows where to look. We can go down to the properties here and see that we have some different properties having to do with this particular field. If we scroll down to the data source section, we'll see that there's a smart object associated none. Let's go ahead and change that. As this opens up, we're going to be presented with a smart box wizard. Previously, before building these applications, you would have created your smart objects by going into the management settings, going through a wizard-based setup, using your logins, your authentication protocols, your server location IDs, and what K2 Appit will do is reach out and authenticate that database. It'll return back the necessary fields and methods that we can interact with, and it'll wrap that all up in what we call a smart object. Once that's done, your smart object goes into your toolbox for you to reuse over and over again within any form. In this case, we already have our smart object built, so let's query for that. I happen to have it saved in a common folder. You can have these saved however you'd like, either by line of business application, maybe a recently used folder, whatever works best for you. In this case, I'm going to dial in and find my CRM account smart object, say OK. And K2 is going to reach out and it's going to return a list of filters that we're able to use that are all just fields being returned back from that CRM database that we can use to search for an account. We're going to search by account name or account number. So you recall from the demo, I simply typed in the first 3 letters of the name, queried, K2 Appit through SmartForm technology reached out to the database and returned a record. When that record is returned, we want to identify it as an account name. This is going to be relevant to the user. We don't need a long number or a random association number within this database. We want to see the actual account name that's relevant to us. We also want to display it as the account name, which is already selected. Okay. As easy as that, we've taken a text field, changed it to a picker field, associated with a CRM database outside of our SharePoint environment, and changed this to a company picker field. The next field down is a contact person. As you recall, this was a drop-down that showed us contacts that were relevant to the company we chose. So let's again change the picker control. We'll change this to a drop-down list this time. And again, we're going to be presented with a wizard on what we can do. So we'll go down here and select the data source type. You'll see we have a slightly different box, as a drop-down is going to give us a few different options over a company picker or a picker control. But it's the same idea. Let's choose our smart object in our common folder where we have it saved. This time we're going to be using our contact smart object. K2 is now going to return a list of fields and methods that we can interact with that particular smart object in that particular database. It's going to return back an account, an entire account. We don't need to see the entire account. What we want to see is a full contact name. So let's go down here and select from all of our different fields, full contact name. As we scroll down, it's defaulted to display an account ID name. Again, not very helpful to the end user. So let's go in here and change this to the full name as well, so that when they drop down the list, we see a person's name relevant to what we want to see. We'll drag our full name in, select OK, and there we are. Now, in order to not return an entire list of contact names from our database, which could range in the thousands, we want to filter this particular dropdown so that it only shows us the contacts relevant to our company record that we've selected. So let's filter this. We want to filter it based on the parent control, which is our company picker. And we want to return back the company ID name to match. Once this is done, it will only show us the full name of contacts that match the account ID name of the company that we've selected in our record, thus showing only relevant contacts to our record that we need to create. We'll set OK, and we're good to go. Our service category is already done for us because it's a SharePoint smart object that already existed. So there's no need to modify this, as it's already ready to go. Now that we've changed our view, we're ready to move on to the form. So let's finish this and move back to our assets. Now that we have our view completed, we can go into our form, clean it up a little bit, make some modifications, and we'll be ready to deploy. So here you can see we have our new form. We'll check this out now. Open this up to edit, and you'll notice that our form designer is very similar to our view designer. Again, we have a menu on the left where we have some objects that we can interact with. We have our actual layout display here that we can use to modify the layout of our form. The context browser to highlight which view we're working with or within what section we're working in. As your forms become more and more complicated, this will become very handy as you can easily navigate to the view or section that you want to manipulate. And we have some properties down here as well. So the first thing that we noticed when we opened up our form is that it had a header. I have a common folder over here with a few different views or sections that I continually use over and over. Instead of building out a header for every form that I use, I want to have some consistency across my organization. So instead of doing that every single time, I can build my header once, save it, and simply drag that particular header in on each form that I want to use it on. By simply dragging it over, you're going to see that we have our header that you saw in the form ready to go. It has our logo, it could have company information, login user information, whatever you want your header to be consistent across all your forms. You can see because of the assets were built for us, it already has our view or section that we worked on that we created. That's all ready to go. But what it's missing still is a tab that showed our customer details. Okay, let's minimize this so we have more screen space to work with. We can go up here to add a tab. Name it whatever we want. In this particular case, it was called Customer Details. And now we have a new section of our form that's empty. Again, this is something I use on a lot of my forms across my organization. So instead of continually building out a view or a section that houses my CRM customer details, I have one pre-built ready to go. I can simply drag this in. And just like that, I have a separate tab with my CRM details ready to go. Moving back to my form, I can make a few last-minute edits if I want to on the form itself. Maybe just to make it look a little different, I can apply a theme. I could go down here and maybe change the width so that it takes up a little more space on my SharePoint site. Just some basic cleanup items. And when I'm ready, I can finish this out. Now, in the span of about 15 minutes, I've gone in, I've created new objects, I've created views and forms, and I've created a workflow. And just like that, I'm able to deploy a form with a workflow behind it very, very easily. You can see now instead of a basic SharePoint form, we have a finished form with some applied themes, some dynamic boxes here. You can see as we put in, we're already live and connecting to our CRM database. As we return a record, a customer details tab appears, and our customer picker is filtered to only show us contacts from AdventureWorks.